Hi everybody, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities and gender equality. I'm Stephen Burrell, and I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people. Hi Sandy, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you, Stephen. It was my choir's summer concert last night, and we ended by singing Billie Eilish's melancholy song, What Was I Made For, from the Barbie movie. So, that's clearly about the trauma of women being scrutinised and objectified, and it just seemed like quite a good introduction to today's conversation. So, how are you doing anyway, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks, Sandy. That's a great point. Yeah, we should probably talk more about the kind of gender politics of the Barbie movie at some point, shouldn't we? But I'm doing okay. I've actually just had my a COVID booster jab today because you can get them for free here in Australia. So hopefully I won't develop any side effects and kind of keel over it if I get a bit sleepy or something. So today we're looking at the issue of pornography in contemporary society, and what are men and boys' experiences of it. What does it tell us about masculinity today? How does it relate to issues like violence against women and girls?
Our guest is Daniel Principe, who is a youth advocate and educator engaging with boys and young men in Australia about issues such as healthy sex and relationships. And Daniel's also a board member of the DART Institute. He's an ambassador for the Women's Resilience Centre and an ambassador for the national campaign Consent Can't Wait.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us today, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Sandy. It's a pleasure.
Okay, yeah, so you've been speaking out for quite some time now about the kind of harms of online pornography. And I guess this isn't something we see many men doing, right? Perhaps especially among younger generations of men. Could we perhaps just start off by asking what was it that led you to do this work and to speak out as you are doing about this?
Yeah, I think like for many of us, when we try to find what is that calling or what is that purpose, what resonates deeply with us, I think we bring so many different threads together. And I think it would be a combination of some of the harms that I have seen, especially to women in close proximity to me, women I dearly love and still love and know and in relationship with, women that I've dated, as well as I think my own experiences of being exposed to pornography as an 11-year-old boy, which I'm happy to touch on more because obviously that acted as a default sex educator long before my first kiss and long before my first sexual experience, as well as I think growing to have a little bit of a suspicion about some of the messages that I'd received from all sorts of media, mainstream social media as that evolved, and pornography. And I guess for me, my background is I'm a health professional, and then I did a postgrad in media and PR here in Sydney, and very interested in this little thing called propaganda. And for me, it's one of the many lenses that I look at all kinds of messages that we're consuming and how it's shaping our attitudes unconsciously and consciously. And that means that applies to me too. I'm not immune to that. And so it's certainly a big lens that I look at. And I think about that a lot in terms of, how did we come to understand our values and attitudes towards women, towards men, towards power dynamics, relationships, sexuality, violence, consent, respect. Those haven't just been taught to us in classrooms. They have been absorbed, I think, for many of us through just unconscious biases and signals that we get from a TV advertisement or a pop music video or gaming or now memes. And I look at all of that and I just want to ask some very sincere questions about what are we learning about ourselves and about one another through the messages that we receive in the day-to-day. And so that's kind of one of the lenses that's brought me to this point. I think, of course, as well, you can look at some realities of exploitation of women, children, and very vulnerable minorities as well within the sex industry. And I know that can be contested in some circles and some people will resist that. But for me, it was a really formative thing when I was 21, and I had friends who'd come back from Cambodia and they were working with women and children who'd been exploited to make sexually explicit material over there. And they brought me back a scarf made by a woman who had, come out of the sex industry and had been given a micro loan to start a new life. And I still have that scarf to this day, and it very much shaped the fact that my consumption of sexual media is not without consequences. And I guess I saw myself in that moment in a new lens as being a patron of the global sex industry and the exploitation inherent to it by driving traffic, driving clicks, driving ad revenue to some of these platforms. Even if I could say, oh, well, that's not what I'm watching or that's not what I'm contributing in, I saw it as contributing to this ecosystem that said people's bodies are commodities up for grabs, up for sexual, gratification, and I'm far removed from them. And that didn't sit well with me. And I think it's just been a journey of certainly not judging others, but asking myself some questions first and foremost, and then looking into a lot of, I guess, feminist thinkers and some of the realities, listening to people who have worked in and around the industry and thought about how it did impact myself and relationships. And then, of course, once you start summoning up a bit of the courage to own your own story, and then you share it, and then you realize there's other stories. And I guess I've just tried to be faithful to all the different stories that I've heard along the way, and certainly wanting to give preference to the stories that I think are least heard in our society.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? How I suppose things like ethical consumption are talked about a lot in our society, but perhaps not so much in relation to pornography, which is interesting. But I guess it's something, there's often this assumption, I think, isn't there, that this is something which is very normalised now among men and boys, perhaps especially younger men. Is that right, based on your own experience of the work you're doing with young people? How widespread would you say that this is? And because you said yourself that it was something you encountered at the age of 11. I think it was similar for me. So obviously this is, it seems to be something which is, young people are encountering from a very young age. So I guess, is it why has it become so mainstream from such a young age, I guess?
Yeah, I guess that's exactly the question we have to ask. And, I put it to our politicians over the last few years in the advocacy space to say, I think we've put the profits of this billion-dollar industry that some record at about $97 billion a year, and the best estimates say it makes up 30% of the internet. I feel like we've put the profits of this industry ahead of the well-being and rights of children. And I feel like that should be an uncontroversial conversation to have, and to say, surely we can all agree, irrespective of our politics and our perspectives, that children being exposed to pornography is not healthy or beneficial for them. And obviously the academics will use the language of sexual scripts, which is just how we make sense of sex between persons and what roles we adopt and how that looks and what feels like, etc., etc. And I guess for me, when we talk about, it has become normalized. And if you are that young boy like I was 11, and I've heard other men say to me, well, of course they didn't think it was anything. Well, they kind of were a bit, what should I think of this? I mean, it's stimulating, but other men are clearly looking at it because this video's got 2 million views. So it clearly, in that, I remember one adult man now saying to me that for him implied, well, other people are doing this too. And in him, it kind of was an internal permission-giving mechanism to say, well, if other people are doing this, well, then there's nothing to really worry about in that sense, even though at first he had discomfort with it as a young person. And I think for me, that's just it, is I think when it has become so normalized in the privacy of our own thoughts, because of course people aren't consuming this out in public together, but within that context, I think it has set us up to say, well, this is normal. And we have seen a big push, but the question we have to ask is, what is it normalizing? What type of sexuality is it reinforcing? What ideas about men and women and minorities and pleasure and consent is it promulgating? And especially within, a heterosexual dominant context, what ideas are we learning? And that's all I want to ask. I'm not here to judge anyone because I consumed porn for 10 years. Most men have been exposed to porn here in Australia. I think it's 95% of men will have been exposed to porn at some point in their life. Here in Australia, for context, some of the research that was published this year by Dr. Flood and Marie Crabb, who are two of the most respected scholars. I know you've had Dr. Flood on your podcast. Their survey was pre-COVID. It was published this year as an academic journal, and they found that 54% of boys are consuming porn every single week, at least once, and 18% every single day. And that's not their fault. I want to be really clear. I want to feel the weight of that, because they ask questions about what kind of education, what kind of cultural shift would we need to help those boys perhaps receive other sex education or other perspectives. And I think that's a really important conversation. But if that's what they're experiencing in those numbers and their mates are doing it, and that's the context, and there's pop-ups that are happening in their online spaces, it does give this sense that this is just normal. This is just the online world. This is just how things are. And for context, and this is what I don't have hard facts for us this evening, is when I ask year 5 and 6 boys here in Australia to pop their hands up if they have had inappropriate pop-ups or sex bots in their YouTube, Discord, Snapchat, online spaces. Now, whether they should be in those spaces is another conversation. But when I ask, has that happened, boys? I have boys in every postcode putting their hands up, 50 to 60% of them. That is what they've been bombarded with, not them searching for it, which also isn't their fault if they're looking for something out of curiosity, if they're trying to make sense of words or concepts that they've heard in the world around them. But I'm saying this to say that this is not young people's fault. And if they have grown up to think, well, this is normal, is it any wonder why? So I'm saying that because I really want to get away from this idea of like, it's young people's fault. Why are they doing this? What's all this about? Blah, blah, blah. Because I hear it too much of that. And what I don't hear enough of is the empathy to lean into their spaces and go, I wonder what it's like. Because puberty and adolescence, I don't know about you gents. Did any of you have a great time in puberty and adolescence? It was just so amazing. It was just so wonderful and affirming and, no. Right? It's hard for every person. And I say this playfully when I get to speak to adults to say, so it was always tough for us. But these young people are now doing it with 3, and now I would argue 4 major social experiments as normative for them. The smartphone, social media, pornographic tube sites, and now AI. None of them they created, but they are navigating it. And that's normative for them. And so it's our job to help them through that, to give them tools, language, encouragement, not to blame them, not to get upset with them, but to really come alongside them and say, I can't imagine what it would be like trying to make sense of my identity, my sexuality, my place in the world, my own body image, in a world where they're bombarded with so many mixed messages, and pretty uncontroversial to say, a lot of pretty unhealthy messages by any measure. And so that's kind of my starting point of why something may be normative and why it's also therefore not their fault. And we have to ask ourselves, how have we got to this state where about 30% of the internet is pornography, and the impact on all of us, because let's be honest, it is all of us. I'm still, I would say, recovering post-porn and unlearning that vision of sexuality and masculinity to something that I think is more equal, more mutual, more reciprocal. Yeah.
We'll probably come back to talking a bit more about education and the impact on young people. But before we do that, you've talked about normalisation of pornography, you've talked about dissemination and production and so on. But what about the actual content and some of the issues with that as well? Do you want to say something about that at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I don't want to lose sight of like how absolutely degrading some pornography is. I think sometimes we allow ourselves to be wooed with this idea of it's just sex, but a lot of modern pornography is extraordinarily violent and degrading and racist. And I think as I sit here thinking about it, I revisit so much of what I've read and some of the accounts of even porn producers themselves trying to elicit the moment where a woman breaks on camera. I hate saying that. And it actually affects me deeply because I've watched these men confess to that. It's publicly available information. I could name the producer's name who said that. He's now since passed. But that should affect us. The fact that we have male porn producers who have said that they set out to see if they could break women on camera. Now, again, I recognize people will quickly want to jump in. They want to get out of the discomfort of this moment and say, well, that's not all porn, or that's, not everybody's like that. Sure. Whatever you need to do to appease that, go for it. But can we sit here and recognize that these are mainstream very well-known, reputable porn producers who drove this industry. Not fringe, not fringe at all, where they were trying to harm women and capture that.
Yeah.
And I would just say that I think pornography is one of the only places where you can get away with violence against women, misogyny, racist tropes, racist language, even homophobic, and that not have significant consequences, where if that happened anywhere else in society, you'd be thrown in front of a discrimination tribunal, and rightfully so. You'd have HR knocking on your door. There would be significant consequences. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that as a society we haven't kind of reckoned with. And I don't kind of understand how we've got to the point that because if sexuality or sexual arousal is present, that kind of all of a sudden is permission giving for whatever then unfolds. And that deeply troubles me. And in terms of some of the research on that, some people will quote different figures that a first-time user on a porn site, 1 in 8 videos is violent. Other people will quote, that most violence is directed towards women, and most of the times they respond in either positive or neutral ways. And that African American women are subjected to more violence, and African American men are portrayed as more violent. And so, you just keep looking at these different lenses of both racism and violence, and you have to ask, like, what is this saying about us? And I think that should deeply trouble us before we try to kind of throw the kind of, what about ethical porn? What about this? What about that? It's like, that makes up less than 1% of the industry, and is a bit of a PR spin to not have to actually sit with the reality of what most mainstream porn represents. And even if it wasn't violent, we still have to ask, what is it conditioning the consumer to understand about their own sexuality? And my thing that I talk a lot about with boys is, I think it shouldn't be controversial to say that as a sexually reproducing species, we're hardwired to some extent for skin-on-skin embodied sexual experiences. I don't think that should be controversial. Gents, step in if it is. And so what this is actually doing is actually rewiring people's neural pathways to respond to the stimulation on a screen and not to embodied, partnered sexual experiences. And we're seeing the consequences of that. I hear it all the time from straight women and gay men about their experiences, and that they can tell the difference. And we can look at the outworkings of that, and they tell me that part of that is the influence of the attitudes, how that influences actual real world behaviour. There was a BBC research undertaken probably 3-4 years ago. BBC funded their own research, and they asked men to report on what violent sexual acts had they performed in the bedroom. And they kind of listed them. There's a table graph of all that. I'm not going to repeat them. And then they asked, and which of those, to what extent did pornography influence your desire to enact these? So it's self-reported. It's men reporting subjectively on their own understanding of how porn has shaped their desire to be sexually violent. And close to 75 to 80% admit that to either some extent or to a great extent, porn has shaped their desire to be sexually violent.
Well, you said quite a bit there about the content. It's abusive, it's objectifying, degrading, and so on and so forth, and also about the impact on people of all genders. But I wondered if you could say a bit more about the harm that it may be causing to boys and young men themselves. I mean, it's actually, in a way, promoting some myths about male sexuality as well, isn't it? Male sexual readiness, penis size, narrowing men's sexual pleasure to just penetration. I can think of a number of ways in which it's promoting certain ideas about how it is to be male and what to be, a male sexual being is. I wonder if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, and that comes back to the sexual scripts and the dominant kind of frame that is how boys feel they need to be, that they need to be violent, they need to be emotionally unattached. That's also something that young women are feeling as well, that sex is meant, their expectations is that this is something that should be violent, it should not necessarily be pleasurable for the young women as well. I've had a lot of young women and adult women disclose over the years saying that they just didn't think it had anything to do with their own experience of pleasure and enjoyment, that it was just kind of they were there as a prop. And that was very much how they felt their partner had engaged in the sexual experience. And again, not all boys, not all men. But again, we're just looking at themes that are shaping. And yeah, I can tell you now, in my work, more boys are conscious of their body image and penis size than ever before. And of course, in none of what I'm suggesting am I suggesting that pornography is the sole contributor to any of the things that we're talking about, because of course it is just part of an ecosystem that I think, if left unchallenged, is just about a idea of male dominance over women and female submission, which I think pornography reinforces in the state of sexual arousal with further conditioning from orgasms. That's why I have an emphasis on it, because it eroticizes that violence and power imbalance. But that's not to say that's the only place that power imbalance and sense of violence and entitlement comes forward. It can come from what's role modeled at home. So in saying that, yeah, boys are learning that is what sex is. Hence, if you asked a group of teenage boys, tell me every word that you know that describes sex, how many of them do you think are not violent or degrading? And I just put that as a rhetorical question, because if you've ever done that exercise with a group of teenage boys, it's alarming. If they feel safe enough that you're not there to judge them or punish them, but to actually be like, yeah, what are all the different words that we use to describe or, in place of sex? And I think that in itself is a snapshot of what I'm trying to articulate and trying to illuminate here. And so that is certainly their understanding of sex is being shaped by that. Not solely, but a significant contributor, especially, as I said, when there's a significant lag between porn consumption, how much it's being consumed, and their actual first sexual experiences. And there's added vulnerabilities when we're not bringing in healthy sexuality education, respect for relationships, consent, when parents don't talk about it. It adds vulnerabilities for both the boys and especially for the girls, because they then are going in blind, not necessarily knowing what to expect from a sexual experience, and it's a huge risk for them. And so, yeah, it is definitely affecting them in that way. I do want to mention, though, eSafety Commission here has just published some research where they've interviewed young men, 15 to I think 22, something like that. And I got to see it before they've published it, and myself and other boy advocates are going to be involved in now taking this data and thinking, what are the practical implications? And what I will say, which I think is really promising, and I think is showing this signs of hope, is the critical literacy is there for young boys. So when engaged to step back, because they actually recognize that there's a lot of harmful messages. So this report is absolutely fantastic. Link it in the show notes. Is it actually shows, no, boys aren't just all obsessed with Andrew Tate and pornography and gaming, and they don't see any of the kind of harmful side effects of all of that. No, they're actually engaging quite critically with it, especially on pornography. So for me, it's, again, like all of us, we're human. We can know what might be healthy for us or less than ideal. Doesn't mean we do that. Doesn't mean that that's how we're actually responding to this supernormal stimulus, which is what pornography is labeled by psychologists. And so they are critical of its message and its impact on them and its impact on how they see sex, relationships, women and men. So that for me is the sign of hope, is that I think we are seeing a shift in our culture with hopefully educators doing similar work to me, even just influencers out there talking about the impacts of pornography has become more mainstream than it ever was. So I don't want to suggest we need to own what is the harmful impacts, but also recognize that it's not all bad. And if we actually engage young people and give them opportunities to have a healthy sexual education and understand consent and look at power dynamics and look at stereotypes, they actually engage pretty spectacularly with this content. And that's certainly what I see on a weekly basis working with young boys here in Australia from year 5 all the way up to college.
Yeah, because I'm actually struck. There's a book, somebody we've had on the podcast before, Dr. Fiona Vera Gray. She's just got a book which has come out recently called Women on Porn, and it's about like women's experiences of porn, just like women in everyday life. And one thing she talks about in that, which I think is really interesting, is that we don't, even though most people, as you say, are using porn, in private, it's not something which is like people feel able to talk about usually very honestly, and that's among adults, let alone young people. And there's that kind of contradiction in there that perhaps among young men, they might kind of boast or joke about porn and even show each other things from it, but still not feel able to have those honest conversations about what's actually going on in porn, what impact that is having on them. And I was just struck while you were talking about things like, the issues like addiction and, sexual dysfunction, like not being able to orgasm without, the use of porn and things like that, like having really damaging impacts on men and boys, sexual health and relationships.
Time magazine and Rolling Stone put that on the map. I think it was 2016 when they interviewed some young men in their kind of early 20s who were logging off porn, and that was because of the erectile dysfunction. Now, again, contested. Some people also don't believe in the addiction framework for pornography. I respect that, right? I'll usually talk about compulsive porn use just to kind of be a bit more of a catch. But boys talk about addiction. They get that. That's a really simple frame to realize when they're like, I can't give it up for more than 2-3 days. So in their mind, I'm addicted. So I also you got to use language that works with an audience, that carries meaning. So, but in terms of, the compulsion, of course, it spikes dopamine, similar to drug taking. It's why obviously some people call it the new drug, these sorts of things, because it spikes dopamine in similar ways. But of course, it's freely accessible, can be consumed anonymously 24/7. And without the same social and public consequences of a young person getting illegal drugs. And so obviously that, and then as I mentioned, the Time magazine article that put this on the map of, some people, again, contested. I'm not here to make a black and white dogmatic claim about it, but porn-induced erectile dysfunction is the term that gets thrown around. And I remember mentioning this in the past. And again, I'm not saying it as a pure reason for it, but once you rule out performance anxiety, medications, mental health issues, hormonal imbalances, there's not a lot to kind of then default to when a 19, 20, 21-year-old young man is unable to be aroused. What else could you attribute it to? And so I've seen this, and I've seen both the Reddit forums, the YouTube forums where men are talking honestly about it. And it came to a head for me with two people in my life. One of them is a pelvic floor specialist here in Australia who mostly works with women, but was having young men come to her clinic with pelvic dysfunction. And she said to me, PhD, and she said to me, like, Dan, I think I'm going to have to screen for pornography, but I don't want to. It was, it was a bit awkward asking these young boys, But I said to her, doctor, I said, I think you're actually going to have to do that as part of your, your patient history, your medical history. And she then was becoming more kind of, okay, I'm going to have to do that. And then just over the summer, I went home to Perth, and my family GP found out what I did for work, and we hadn't seen each other for at least a decade. And so I went in and interviewed him. And I said, Doc, like, what are you seeing? And he said to me, I'm seeing guys in their early 20s, late teens coming in here asking me for Viagra. And I said, what do you put that down to? And he goes, it's definitely the stuff they're watching, because the real stuff doesn't compete. That's what he said. And I'd actually heard this from some college professors in the US who said that they were prescribing Viagra to college students, rather than obviously going to the source. And again, not purely pornography, but you'd want to step back and at least make sure you rightly understand what's happening here. And so, that is a really fascinating phenomenon. You're not going to get a pop-up on a porn site that says, are you aware that this may impact your mental health, your body image, your sexual function, your relational satisfaction, your sexual satisfaction? You don't get that, unlike when you buy alcohol, or we have obviously serious campaigns about other things that may harm us in society, car accidents for young people, drugs for young people. They get a lot of information about making good decisions around this, and an informed decision. And that's something that has been lacking unless they have had someone come in and facilitate a conversation like this.
So we wondered if you could tell us a little bit more, Daniel, about the work that you're doing with boys and young men in schools to try and create change, and perhaps you could give us some insight into how you approach sessions in a school and say something about the kind of responses you get from boys and girls.
Yeah, it's such a privilege. Like, I don't take it lightly. When I get to speak to the educators and the parents community, I say I don't take it lightly that I'm a strange man who's waltzed into your school and obviously asked, and permission granted. But I've waltzed into your school and I've talked to your young people about some really significant topics that you guys may even hold to be sacred, in some pockets. And I don't take that lightly. I guess for me, I sum up my work in a really simple tagline that says champion boys, challenge culture. And their responses, like this week I had the profound privilege to go to my old high school for the first time, which is a place of both deep heartache for me, but also deep, joys and identity forming and challenges. And to have the opportunity to, give boys an opportunity that I didn't have to have conversations about all this was just so magnificent. And that for me is where the hope lies, because most boys say they haven't yet had conversations about stereotypes and respect and consent. And so we can't expect them then to understand things and then demonstrate character that they haven't yet had opportunities to grow into. Where I see just the most profound moments have got nothing to do with my slides. It's when the boys themselves just lean in with such beauty and empathy that I just find myself in awe. Like the other day, I was in regional South Australia and some year 5 and 6 boys just forever changed me. Like, I was just so moved by them. We just left the slides because one of them decided to talk about what it was like to be bullied after he'd lost someone very close to him in life. And this boy started to get emotional and the tears started to fall. And there he was with the year 5 and 6 boys from his school and another school sitting in the room, because it's a small country town. And this boy was met with the boys next to him and around him, getting up and rubbing his shoulder, checking in on him and comforting him. And I think to myself, like, what would the world look like if that was every boy's experience when they were going through grief, pain, loss, tragedy? What would that look like, rather than being shamed and here in Australia being told all sorts of awful names, and especially at that pivotal age going from primary to high school? And I think to myself, what would the world look like if there was more of that, where that's how they experienced one another's humanity? And that's what keeps me going. And like, that's not me, that's them. And it's an honor to have a front row seat for those moments. Yeah. And I've got to witness something similar several times, especially those younger boys, the 5s and 6s. They haven't had the empathy knocked out of them. The kind of callousness of Australian kind of ladsy culture hasn't yet taken hold yet. And I think to myself, they're going to have to grow up and be men who are both strong and kind, and take responsibilities and the realities of life. And that's going to find us all. But I think to myself, what would it look like if we could continue to nurture that and welcome that as part of their masculinity, and let's be honest, just their humanity? And for me, that's like the bigger task, because you nurture that. You don't need respect classes, consent classes. I'm not saying you don't need them. Believe me, I'm a consent ambassador. But it's like, if you have that level of empathy and EQ and intuition and care, you don't need to be told, don't make inappropriate jokes. Don't, coerce, don't harm someone, because you have fundamental value and disposition towards others, that they matter, that they're human, that their preferences and wishes should be honored. And that for me is like, where I hope that this work continues to trend. Like, it's great to talk about all these topics and hear their insights, but that's the incredible stuff. And that one boy then catalyzed every single boy nearly in that room, putting his hand up, wanting his turn to talk about some grief in his life. And then a few other boys were tearing up. And for me, that's like the transformative power of these conversations. Yeah, I've got content to get through and facts to quote and stories to share, but that's actually the goal, however we get there. Not that they cry, but that they really connect with one another's humanity and care for one another. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where it's at. And the older boys, I think for me, it's when I see them create a culture where instead of jeering at each other and trying to tear each other down, that you see them get around one another. And there's always a bit of playfulness and bravado in it, but I think it's like, how do we harness that for good? And I was recently in regional Queensland, and these year 9 boys, so 14, 15-year-olds, were doing so well that day. Had the full day with them. And we'd already worked through the intro presentation. We were then workshopping stereotypes, the idea, obviously, as sociologist Kimmel talks about, the good man versus the real man. And we were also then talking about respectful relationships and what red flags would be, especially around coercive control, which sadly is affecting young people in higher and higher rates. And I turned to their head of wellbeing, because these boys were just lapping it up. Their insights were just brilliant. It was so remarkable. I mean, these guys were exceptional. And then I split them off into small groups, and I said, nominate a leader. You all have a different leader. You know, you choose him. He's got to lead you well, but you've got to listen to him and respect him, and vice versa. And because I want to give them responsibility, I want them to own it. And I whispered into their head of wellbeing's ear, and I said, I'm going to ask them a bit more of a mature question. I hope you're okay with it. And they've just done so well, so I want to kind of raise the stakes a little bit. And my question to them was, what's missing from pornography? And I said, leaders in the groups, facilitate that conversation amongst the boys that you're entrusted to engage with. And the room had quite a lot of energy in it. There was a lot of noise, and you could hear the boys, and they're kind of interjecting on each other, and they're like, right, this is what, and they were animated. I thought, is there any silliness in here? And as I walked around the room, I realized they were really engaged with this discussion. And I was like, wow, this is going well. And I'm hearing some really incredible conversations taking place between these year 9 boys. Now, I never make anyone kind of do anything in my sessions. It's always an invitation. And then I said, once they'd had about 10 minutes to discuss this, I said, boys, once you're done, once you wrap it up, if the leaders want to join me up here up the front, I'd love you to share what your group came up with, and I'll pass you the microphone. And all 12 of the group leaders rushed to the front and were ready to speak to this. And I then gave them the microphone one after another. And they're about to speak out in front of, I think, 140 peers in the room, year 9 boys. And this is what they said to what's missing from porn. Consent. Respect, emotional connection, love, intimacy, romance, what the rest of their lives look like, what they did earlier that day, what their actual relationship is. And I had 14, 15-year-old boys saying that in front of their peers. Love, romance, intimacy, from 14, 15-year-old boys in front of 100 plus of their peers. And they celebrated that, and we celebrated them in that. And for me, as I said, some of that research proves that, but I get to see that in real time, that they can think critically through this. And I think for me, it's about, we can't make anybody want something. But you hope that in sharing that and normalizing that and encouraging that, these are boys that are hopefully going to have more of a desire for mutual, equal relationships, whatever that looks like for them and their romantic interests. We just hope that is something that they carry with them and see as, hey, normal now. And of course, that'll need to be reinforced because it's not a one-off moment. But I know that's in there, and they know that's in there.
Thanks for talking such a moving way about your work with boys and young men. It's incredible. I mean,
one thing I was wondering, Daniel, as well, is like thinking beyond education. like, what do you think we need to be doing about this? You know, both in terms of like government, like things like regulation, like age verification is being talked about here in Australia at the moment, for example, and in the UK.
Absolutely.
But also on a personal level, you know, like we as men, I mean, do you think basically we should be giving this up? You know,
Oh gosh, there's a bit to speak to there. So yeah, absolutely. We need to engage our young people, all of them. You know, we need to do that. We need to do that as educators. We need to teach respect and consent. But if we're going to bring our educators, if we're going to implement curriculum, it has to be porn critical. We can't neglect this. We can't avoid this because it is acting as a default sex educator for lots of young people. And the effects of, say, porn culture, whether a young person is consuming or have been exposed, still permeate our culture. So we need to engage with it. So I would say that both educators and any programs have to acknowledge the impact, and they can find that in our Australian Institute of Family Studies report from 2017, our Watchers report from 2020, even the National Plan to Address Violence Against Women acknowledges now pornography as a driver. They can obviously check out some of the recent research from the Man Box, which acknowledges the harms of pornography. Obviously, Dr. Flood, Marie Crabb's work, Professor Salter's work here, especially in the child safety and child safeguarding space. I think there's a bit of a push towards all of this. So that information exists. It's out there. I think it's now about, implementing that and having those conversations. Check out the Consent Can't Wait campaign. There's some great resources and conversation starters out there. So that's on that level. And on the schools, on the parents, I think for young people, we also have to help them put up healthy guardrails. Hence, we're now seeing a global push of delaying social media to 16. I welcome that. I think some of the best thinkers in this space have recognized that. Again, it's hard, and you'll be a pariah if you're the only parent doing it, but if we could actually shift culture where that becomes an easier proposition for those parents who are seeking to delay as much as possible, I think, we want to see that push. And obviously getting phones out of kids' pockets at schools. I was at a school in far north Queensland, 6 weeks ago. How do teachers compete with this? This staff member said to me, you're trying to teach arithmetic, and then the lunch just beforehand, the boys are gambling, watching porn and gore videos online before coming into class. It's like, how do you compete with that dopamine spike and arousal from all of that? To then try and teach after that. So of course, getting kids off screens, especially at school, is just so essential. Obviously, age verification that you touched on, Stephen, that's something that people have been campaigning for a long time, longer than me. I've been campaigning probably for 7 years. Got to meet with the communications minister last year in Canberra to discuss this. And now the current government has agreed to pilot a trial, which was eSafety's recommendation here to government. So it's taken longer than we'd hoped because it had bipartisan support from a committee 2 years ago now, at least, which is fantastic to be able to say that. But as you can see, it takes a long time. And now we're saying we're going to pilot just a trial. Whereas, of course, we want a comprehensive system rolled out. And for some people think, is that just a tick box to say you're 18? No, it's a comprehensive system. There's lots of different providers that do deliver this technology. So you can go to the Age Verification Providers Association. They have all the Q&As, whether you're the concerned consumer, parent, organization, etc., on how it all works. I'm not a tech guru. I just know, having spoken to these guys, that this tech exists and it's already being used hundreds of millions of times already online. And I think it's not going to be a silver bullet. No one who is porn critical and advocating for age verification thinks, this will solve our problems. But it's certainly going to stop that exposure for, say, the very young kids. I'm thinking like primary school kids who are seeing pop-ups or, being exposed through innocent search terms or these sorts of things. If it can stop that, that would be such a huge win in and of itself, given that the UK Children's Commission report says that 10% of 9-year-olds have seen porn, 27% of 11-year-olds. And I think those numbers are conservative. I had a friend who I studied with who messaged me just last week who said, Dan, I've always, she'd been sympathetic to my work, but she said, I didn't realize how significant it was until she said 7 and 8-year-olds were sharing porn on an iPad at her son's primary school just last week. And I don't know who can resist the idea of doing something to at least stop that. Like I said, for the very, very young children, And so age verification, absolutely. We need to see what's going to happen. My question, and this is beyond my pay grade and my skill set, is like, how will we evaluate its efficacy? That's what I'm really interested in, because of course the porn industry doesn't want this. They've had a massive sook in a tantrum, to use that kind of language, in the US. They put things up and pop up saying you can't access our website because your government in X state has done X, Y, Z. And they're not happy with this. That needs to happen. We need to know how it will be evaluated and how to mitigate some of those risks from a $97 billion industry that does not want this as a barrier. And nobody thinks, as I said, it's the full solution. But that is definitely, I think, something. And your last question I love, because at the end of the day, if we don't change things culturally, which is really just us humans and how we relate to each other and what stories we tell, what heroes we have, what we celebrate. If we don't change that, then you can have all the best tech, the best policy, the best education in the world. Now, of course, all of that shapes education and shapes attitudes. But yeah, I think as men, we have to be honest in telling our stories and owning this. And I always find that there's the really interesting reality here is this has become normalized. Some people, think it's not a problem, but at the same time, we're a bit sheepish more broadly about even talking about it. And we have to ask why that is. And some people will just go straight to, there's stigma. I'm not convinced that's the full explanation for it all. I wonder if there is a discomfort, just like I had and just like many other men that I've spoken to have had, with what this may say about them and perhaps what they may have to feel and acknowledge and grieve from as they acknowledge what they have consumed and at whose expense. And I think that is probably what I'm interested in. And that's why I take a complete eradication of shame approach. I can't even tell you how many people have disclosed their porn use to me, and I can hand on my heart say I've never judged or shamed anyone. I've said thank you so much. I appreciate your bravery. I respect that so much, and it's great that you want to talk about it. And I think we just have to do that more and more. And I caught up with a high school friend who I rarely see over the weekend in Perth, and here we're not necessarily that close, and if he was to ever listen to that, please don't take that as an affront, my friend, but we just see each other like maybe at best once every couple of years, once a year at most, and just being able to walk together and talk. And he said, he had even started to reflect on what he had learnt from porn and pop culture about sex, and he used the expression bam bam thank you ma'am. And that was his way of articulating what I believe was him suggesting I learnt that this was just something I did to somebody else, and I got what I want and moved on. And do you know what? That's an incredible starting point. And I just listened, and we talked about that, and then we talked about, what might else could sex be like for us, and obviously for our partners. And one of the things I always think, and I certainly don't want to make out like I've arrived in this, and I'm trying to work out what does it look like to be a decent, safe, loving, kind, respectful man that all women and all men feel safe around, whether they're my partner or whether they're just my neighbor. But I certainly, in the context of sex, I want to ask the question, surely we need to come up with a vision of sexuality and our masculinity, or just our humanity, where we're intrinsically concerned about how our partner is experiencing this. And I wrote about this a little bit for SBS Insight, that that for me is what just the narrowness of consent education can't articulate, is how do we get us to want that and to care about that and to be concerned about the other, and to have conversations like, hey mate, surely you want your partner, your lady, whoever, to enjoy this, don't you want to know that they're having a good time too, that they feel safe, that they feel respected, all these sorts of things. And just to kind of normalize the fact that, don't you want to be a good lover, for lack of a better term, don't you want to be, someone that your partner enjoys being with and is like, oh yeah, this is great for me too. And so I think a lot about how do we normalize that. And I know I'm trying to do that as best as I can with my friends near and far, and then plant those seeds. But I think, the biggest thing is just men owning their stories in this space. And I've seen to great effect when communities do that. I saw one community before I spoke in their particular context, shared like a montage of their men in their community and some of their kind of fatherly figures who were acknowledging and talking about how young they were when they were exposed to porn. It was so powerful, because I usually don't get to go and speak after some montage where the community who's invited me in has gone to the trouble of having some of the people in their community actually say, I was 12, I was 13, I was 14, I was 11, I was 9. Because that creates such a different context to then come and share into, because it's like, wow, we're not just here to say, oh, it must be those guys out there or those people or those weirdos down there. It's like, hey, let's talk about that here too. And for me, I'm not saying this prescriptively to any potential future communities, schools, groups that will invite me, but I thought, wow, that was such an earnest endeavor to actually say, no, we don't want to just leave this as an intellectual conversation and make it about that poor fellow over there, but actually say, hey, no, this is just stuff that we've all had to navigate, so let's just be real about it.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Daniel, for giving it your time to speak to us, and for the really inspiring work you're doing, and really brave work. So thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
Great
to have heard about what you've been doing, and please keep doing it and encourage other men to do it too. We need as many as we can in this community.
Reach out, gents, if you want to share your story in whatever field of work and in whatever influence you have. If this at all resonates with you, I can't scale me. What a horrible thought to replicate mini-me's. But if people want to use their own authentic gifts, talents, disposition in the world, and own their story authentically, that's the only qualifier. I'd love to connect with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you, gents. Thank you.
So it was great to hear Dan talking in such positive terms about particularly boys and young men. We don't hear that very often, but he's clearly very, very committed to their well-being and their education and so on and so forth. So I love that aspect. But at the same time, I guess, I was thinking, this is a difficult topic, and in a way, we do need to be made to feel a little bit uncomfortable if we're going to make progress around this issue. It's not all positive, and I'm sure he wouldn't say it was, but that struck me as interesting. And also I think that he was clear that you can do these sessions in schools, in colleges, which he does, but also that the whole structures around this issue are absolutely key. He was very moving about how the industry, exploits vulnerable women, girls, boys. That matters as well, I think. And he was clear that the structures around are key. What did you make of Daniel's conversation?
Yeah, absolutely, Sandy. I think those are really great points. And I think it's so true. And I think perhaps porn is still something which is seen as being kind of edgy and cool, even though actually in reality, it's typically channeling very conservative, old-fashioned ideas about sex and gender and sexuality. It is sexualizing and eroticizing unequal power dynamics. That is the foundation of the vast majority of porn that's out there, I think, isn't it? And what's more, these are billion-dollar companies, as Daniel said. These are massive, money-making machines who are very much invested in, getting us hooked from a young age on their content. And I think, as Daniel showed, it's doing huge damage to men and boys ourselves, in that way, in lots of different ways. And I think back to what he mentioned about shame. which is why I do think that, I think he's kind of trying to look at boys and men in a positive way is helpful, isn't it? Because I actually think porn kind of benefits and profits from the shame lots of men feel. And I do think back to, I think it was a presentation that Fiona Vera Gray gave once where she talked about, a man that I think she'd spoken to, about his porn use, and how, like, immediately after orgasming, he'd like push his laptop away from him because he felt so disgusted with like what he'd just watched. So I think lots of men do actually feel very uncomfortable and ashamed about what they're watching because they don't actually agree with it in terms of their morals, their principles, but they can't stop watching it and they feel ashamed about that. And I think porn benefits from that, right? It keeps us it keeps us in a low state, in a low mood, right? And it profits from that sense of shame because you go back to it then, right? If you're not feeling good about yourself, then you go back to it for that kind of dopamine hit that Daniel talked about. So it's this really unhealthy relationship with shame.
I mean, I was interested what he had to say about critical literacy as well. And he gave the example of boys in a particular school. I think it was year 9 in Queensland, and he said that they were bringing a level of analysis to what they saw, which people didn't perhaps expect. I think that's very interesting. But given the force of the industry, which he described and you described, you're swimming against a huge tide there, really.
Yeah, and I do think as well, like, it is, given that obviously our focus is on masculinity, I think it's really interesting to think about what is this industry saying about masculinity, what representations of manhood is it coming up with, and obviously there's all the stuff which is violent and abusive in all sorts of ways, which it's kind of normalizing. But even beyond that, I think beyond that kind of content, which is very mainstream within porn, but even things which isn't directly, obviously, kind of about those unequal power dynamics and violence and stuff. I think the way we think about porn, the way porn is designed, is primarily for men, isn't it? It's just aimed at the male gaze, as if sex itself is for men, right? And I think that is still very much how we talk about and see sex, isn't it? As a society, this is something which primarily exists for male pleasure. And that's how women are made to feel from a young age, isn't it? Is that they should be prioritizing, in a heterosexual context, they should be prioritizing their male partner's pleasure. And that's how men are taught to see it, that our needs and wants are the only thing that really matter. And again, I think that's a very kind of conservative, harmful idea of sex. And it's just really sad, isn't it? That something which should be so fun and joyful and an amazing aspect of being human is turned into something which is so unimaginative and boring and oppressive and ultimately harmful.
Yeah. He also made me think of a book that I read some years ago called Getting Off, by Robert Jensen, which is a very hard read, but I still think it's a very powerful and important book. And in the end, it's about the damage and the horror of the sex industry, if you like, and pornography in particular. But I think Robert Jensen ends up by saying, well, how useful is the concept of masculinity? Can we actually reform masculinity, or is it something that we should really eliminate and just say, look, we're all human. We don't need to live with try and reform, this conception of masculinity, which is based around dominance and control and coercion and so on and so forth. And that's an argument we've heard on the podcast before, and I still think is quite a powerful one, really. I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer to this, but the notion that you can create somehow a sort of healthy masculinity as opposed to the negative messages coming from the porn industry, it's a difficult line to tread. But he made me think about that again, and I'm sure it's something we'll return to at other times in the podcast too. How useful is masculinity actually? And his book's subtitle is Pornography and the End of Masculinity. you know, and I do wonder about that a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, because you do think, you know, if this is always something which is constructed in relation to femininity, and it's something which is always ultimately, you know, kind of seen in a hierarchical way above femininity, you know, for example, in the context of porn and sex, which is so often depicted as being, you know, that men are the ones in charge, men are the ones making the decisions, we're the ones who should be taking the initiative and so on and so forth, then maybe we do need to break away from that binary altogether and just be human, yeah. Well, anyway, that's probably enough for 1 week. But yeah, thank you so much, as always, everybody, for listening. Do subscribe to Now a Man if you haven't done so already, for lots more conversations like this, which hopefully aren't too depressing for your podcast listening. Yeah, look after yourselves. Contact us at nowaman@gmail.com if you have any comments or feedback, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Talk soon. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.